All right, I think we can begin. Thank you everybody for joining this last talk of our first block of Landscapes Live. We're very happy that so many have tuned in every week. And I'm also happy to let you know that the fall block is already taking shape. So you can look forward to the seminar series continuing in the fall, starting up from mid-September. And my name is Vivi Petersen and I'm chairing the seminar today. And we also have Philip Steer as the moderator. And our speaker today is Georgie Bennett from the University of Exeter in the UK. And Georgina did her BSc and MSc in Durham in geography. And then in 2009, she moved to Switzerland to do her PhD at the ETH, working on landslides and debris flow processes. And then she moved to the US, where she did the postdocs at the University of Oregon and at the US Forest Service and Colorado State University. And then in 2017, she moved back to the UK as a lecturer in physical geography, first at the University of East Anglia and now at the University of Exeter. And broadly speaking, Georgina, she's working to quantify, monitor, and model Earth surface processes operating in mountain landscapes, and with a strong link towards natural hazards, I think, as we'll also see today. And today she will give a talk with the title Hazardous Landscapes Towards Landslide Early Warning in Nepal and the Philippines. And after Georgie's talk, you're all welcome to ask questions. You can either use the chat that we will activate again at the end of the talk, or you can raise your hand, and you find that option in the bottom of the participants list. And if you raise your hand, we can turn on your microphone and then you can ask your question directly to Georgie. Yes, and I think with this, I'll give you the word, Georgie. I will just stop sharing and you can share your slides.
Okay, so hopefully you can see the slides, not the presenter view.
Yes, now we see your slides.
Great.
Good.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Vivi, for the introduction, and to all of the organisers of this webinar. I've really enjoyed all of the other talks so far. So yes, today I'm going to be giving a talk on hazardous landscapes towards landslide early warning in Nepal and the Philippines. This is an overview of two projects that I'm leading, Boulder in Nepal and SCARP in the Philippines, both funded by a combination of NERC and DFID, Department for International Development in the UK. And this is work that I started while still at UEA, and as Vivi said, I'm now based at the University of Exeter. And much of the work I'm going to present today has been done by my two fabulous postdocs, Benedetta Dini, who's working on Boulder, and Claudia Abanco, who's working on SCARP. So why do we care about landslide hazards? Well, they occur all over the world in mountainous regions, killing at least 5,000 people per year and costing around $20 billion per year globally, or actually 17% of costs of all natural hazards. And there's a real concentration, as you can see from this nice map from Froud and Petley, of landslides in the Himalayan region, well, in Asia generally, but in the Himalaya and also in the Philippines. I'm hoping that you can see my mouse okay. So yes, this is the region, these are some of the regions that we're investigating. So as I said, my talk is going to be split into two parts. In part one, I'm going to talk about an aspect of our boulder project, developing smart boulders to monitor slow-moving landslide dynamics in Nepal. And a second part looking at establishing meteorological drivers of shallow rainfall-triggered landslides in the Philippines. So this is work kind of in progress, in preparation at the moment. And a common theme or goal of both of these projects is moving towards landslide early warning, but I would say that we're still, we've got some way to go, both in the community and certainly in these projects, but ultimately it would be great to be able to reduce some of the impacts of these hazards in these two regions. So in the first part, I'm going to be talking about slow-moving landslides, which occur, they're deep-seated landslides that occur in clay-dominated lithologies around the world. I've done a lot of work on slow-moving landslides in Northern California, in the melange there. And there are several challenges regarding early warning of these landslides. They don't always behave in a very predictable way. Some of them do and have relatively predictable failure trajectories and accelerate towards failure, and we might have some hope of predicting the final point of failure based on existing theory. Others follow a more step-like evolution in their displacement with periods of acceleration followed by periods of stability, making it very challenging to actually say when they might eventually fail. And indeed, some landslides are stable for many years, many decades, and may not ever fail. Obviously, in order to have some chance of predicting failure of either type of landslide, we need measurements of displacements in real time. And this is something that we're working towards using a new technology on the boulder project in Nepal. And of course, equally importantly, sort of social science aspects of early warning are also really important around communication of these warnings and responsibility for these warnings, which is not something I'm going to touch on so much today. So this is a really nice study by Alexander Handwerker and co-workers of a landslide, Mud Creek in California, that had been stable for many years and was driven to failure by extreme drought over the preceding decade up until around 2015, and then extreme rainfall. And here in the middle, we can see the displacement time series of 3 landslides in California with Mud Creek in blue. And this study identified a divergence from the characteristic seasonal velocity pattern, which could have been used in some sort of early warning and shows potential for the future for early warning of these more complex landslides. This is another nice example of the use of InSAR again for monitoring displacement of a landslide that behaved in a slightly more predictable way, and was actually this study showed that it would have been predictable based on the displacement measurements up until the point of failure using this so-called inverse velocity method. However, temporal resolution of InSAR still poses a challenge for prediction. I think at best it's 6 days resolution of these InSAR images. And so ground-based displacement measurements are still really important for validating InSAR and other remote sensing-based approaches, and for monitoring displacement and coming up with early warnings in their own right. So this is just, there's the number of traditional approaches such as extant sensometers and total stations, as well as a number of emerging approaches. So in this case, passive RFID sensors that have been placed over part of a slow-moving landslide in Switzerland, and have been shown to nicely reproduce the displacement of this landslide compared to more traditional approaches. So I was excited to come across this study at ETU Online this year. And there are lots of advantages of this technology, which is more typically used to monitor, for example, cobble transport in rivers. These are small sensors, cheap and long-lived, but a downside of the passive RFID sensors is that they have to be close enough to an antenna in order to give any data. And so there's a challenge of finding stable locations for these antennas. But still, this is a promising technique for putting sensors across the landslide and really being able to understand spatial variation in movement across these landslides. So on our boulder project, we are, one of the objectives is to develop a tracking system for boulders. And in fact, this has evolved into developing smart boulders for landslide monitoring and early warning. So this is in preparation at the moment, and a lot of the nice figures and work I'm going to show you has been done by Benedetta Dini. So these work not in a dissimilar way to passive RFID sensors in that they communicate via radio waves, but they are active sensors. So they have a battery attached to them and can send data over long distances, so hundreds of meters. And they are low power, so they can be triggered by movement and otherwise be in sleep mode. So they can last many months or even years, monitoring landslide movement. And they are also relatively cheap, not as cheap as passive RFID, but only a couple of £100. And they have an accelerometer and a GPS. So there are other groups who are developing similar types of sensors around the world as well, but maybe not quite like these in that these manage to be so low powered, but still have quite a high resolution of measurement. And actually, you'll be wondering why there's an image of a bird when we're in a geomorphology webinar. But these sensors were initially developed as a collaboration between ecologists at the University of East Anglia, including one of my co-investigators, Aldina Franco, and the British Trust for Ornithology, as well as some researchers in Portugal, as part of this MoveTech telemetry spin-off company. And the software engineer that helps to develop the technology is Miramiko in Switzerland. So in the case of birds, the GPS has been really helpful for illustrating and revealing bird migration pathways around the world. And the accelerometer has been really helpful to understand bird behavior, both in flight and feeding behavior on the ground. So yes, we're really interested in adapting these sensors to understand something about boulder movement within landslides. So we aim to explore the potential of this technology for measuring landslide displacement, but also debris flow dynamics. So as well as being able to capture slow tilt, an accelerometer also has the potential to measure impact forces. And actually, G-force meter is one of the apps that you can install on your phone to play around with this, giving an impact to your phone and seeing the G-force that results. So yes, as I said, this is part of the Boulder project, accounting for boulders in landslide, flood, disaster evaluation and resilience. We've got a few objectives on this project, one of which I don't have time to talk about today, but is very interesting as well, is establishing controls on boulder production in this landscape. And trying to improve landslide hazard maps by somehow accounting for this additional hazard posed by boulders. But today I'm going to focus on our first two objectives, developing this tracking system to observe boulder movement in landslides and floods. We've focused so far on landslides, and to set the basis for a future landslide flood early warning system. Again, we've focused on landslides for this effort. And this study is based in the Upper Botakosi catchment that some of you might be familiar with in Nepal. So around 4 hours northeast of Kathmandu, where They have a lot of landslide and flood problems. So these boulders are jammed behind a hydropower infrastructure, hydropower plant along the river. And these were sort of bulldozed into these locations by an outburst flood in 2016. And potentially some of these boulders were deposited in the channel by prevalent landsliding in the 2015 earthquake. The landslide that we chose to look at is located at the village of Hindi, which is along the Aranaco Highway, which is actually one of the links between Nepal and China. There's a customs point just up the road here for goods coming in from China. And this has both a slow-moving component of the landslide, outlined by the red dashed line, as well as a debris flow channel along one of the flanks of the landslide. You can see this in this image on the right as well, that seems to evacuate some of the material brought down by the landslide that's kind of retrogressing up the hill slope. And this landslide causes problems for the village, for farming activity on these terraces, and for stability of houses. And obviously the occasional debris flows tend to cause damage to the road, as well as houses in the village. So we think this is a reactivated paleo landslide deposit. The soil, the matrix material seems to be highly sheared, and obviously with lots of embedded boulders for us to tag. And there's really no sign of bedrock. And we think that this was reactivated in roughly 2017, and it tends to move with every monsoon season. So in April 2019, ahead of the 2019 monsoon season, we went out to install our wireless sensor network, with the main component being the sensors that I introduced you to within boulders on the Hindi landslide, shown on the left-hand side of the valley here. And as I mentioned, these activate on detecting movement and then record anything from small angular variations to large impact forces. These send their data in near real time to a long-range wide area network receiver, LoRa gateway, on the other side of the valley. It's important to have line of sight here. And this receiver boosts or sends the data up to the GSM network, which then sends this up to the cloud onto a server where we can find the data. So this is just to give you a kind of taster of some of our fieldwork in 2019. We conducted kind of a bit of a recce of the valley and decided on this particular landslide, as well as deciding where we wanted to tag on the landslide. Here's Benny admiring some of the nice back-tilted terraces near the SCARP of the landslide. This is our trusty technician Gareth, who drilled all the holes in the boulders. We had quite a bit of sort of testing and last-minute programming of the tags to do with various different settings we decided upon. This is Andreas, the software engineer, Benny and Aldina, all looking a bit stressed because this coincided with a party of teenagers arriving up from Kathmandu to Borderlands where we were staying. This is Aldina sealing in one of the tags with resin. We had to choose a site for the gateway. This is on top of someone's house. We pay the people of the house to maintain the gateway for us. We installed a rain gauge, which also communicates via the wireless network. And we met with the locals to tell them what we were up to and get permission for the work that we were doing. These are some of the boulders on the left-hand side of the screen that we tagged. Some of them are sort of wholly embedded or partly embedded in the landslide body, and some of them are basically sitting on top of the channel, ready to be moved potentially by a debris flow. So we tagged 23 boulders in total, and we also installed time-lapse cameras to try and validate some of our boulder movements. We conducted scans, laser scans of the channel, both before and after the monsoon, with help from our project partner, GFZ, and installed some seismometers, which have already been shown to capture sediment transport in the glacial lake outburst flood by Kristen Cook in the middle here, and co-authors. So they kindly put their seismometers back in to try and detect any debris flow activity within the debris flow channel opposite. So these are some of our results. Some of the movement of boulders that we tagged over the 2019 monsoon season. There was no particularly extreme rainfall based on the GPM data, at least, because our rain gauge ran into problems. There was no significant debris flow activity detected by GFZ seismometers. However, we did detect movement of 10 boulders. So 6 of these are on the slow moving rotational part of the landslide, and 4 of these are in the debris flow channel. So all of the coloured circles are boulders that moved. The white circles are boulders that didn't display any movement. And the colours are actually, well, the colour changes with the timing of the onset of movement of the boulder, from yellows in May to dark red in August, towards the end of the monsoon season. You can also see the areas that were captured by the time-lapse field cameras, and the areas that were scanned using terrestrial laser scanning and showed some movement. So there's not always exact overlap between our movements observed with our boulders and these validation methods, but there's some overlap in cases that allows us to kind of validate the movements that we're seeing. Interestingly, well, perhaps not surprisingly, only the smallest boulders moved within the debris flow channel. We had some particularly big ones of kind of several meters across that didn't move an inch. And on the slow moving part of the landslide, we observed clustering in the timing of movement of the landslide, which I think is really interesting and shows promise in using this technology to understand the kinematics of these slides. So at the top here near the SCARP, we had movement of one of the boulders in May, then down in the middle of the landslide in June, a bit further down in sort of late June, July, and then one up here that moved in August. So I'm just going to show you some examples of the accelerometer time series that we got from boulders, firstly on the landslide, and then from some in the debris flow channel. I should say that the GPS sensor, so all the data I'm going to show you is accelerometer data related to the tilting and tipping of these boulders. The GPS data that works really well for tracking bird movements, probably because birds are up near the satellites and moving a long distance anyway. The GPS didn't seem to like being buried in a boulder and sealed with resin, and had sort of tens to hundreds of meters of error. So just not feasible for actually measuring displacement. So these are 5 of the tagged boulders with the accelerometer data, so movement along the 3 different axes of the boulder throughout the monsoon season from mid-May till the end of October. And here we're just seeing a real kind of gradual tilt of these boulders within the slow moving landslide body. You can kind of see what's going on from these schematics up in the top right, of sort of only a few degrees and very gradually, at least in the case of these top 2 panels. We do have validation of movement of this A226 which moved a bit more kind of suddenly and rapidly towards the end of August into September. And the image on the lower right here shows some displacement of various points that was measured between time-lapse camera footage. And you can see actually these black bars in the panel along the bottom show the displacement in centimeters measured from these time-lapse images that, at least in the case of these black bars in early September, correlates nicely with the movement captured by these two lower boulder tags. And here we're seeing three boulders within the debris flow channel that showed much sharper rotations of kind of a greater angle, and these kind of nice bread models, as we call them, because these boulders look a bit like sourdough bread or something, show movement of kind of up to 45 degrees in this case along the y-axis, and almost, I think, 180 degrees in the central panel here, and similar in the bottom panel here. So there was some uncertainty that's visualized by these green bars, just because we had some power issues with our gateway that are now resolved. So some issue with the timing of these, although this top panel here shows this movement was captured in real time, showing potential for capturing the initiation of debris flow activity potentially, although in this case we were just observing individual movements of boulders potentially related to kind of slumping of the channel banks. And also I will point out that the yellow bars on panel A at the bottom here show periods of movement detected from time-lapse footage of the channel, with some of these tying in, with the movements of these boulders tying in with these periods of movement detected by time-lapse camera footage. And as I said, we also have terrestrial laser scan data. So here we're seeing the debris flow channel, and with up to 6 meters of erosion in blue and deposition in red occurring on the banks of this channel, and potentially explaining why Bennett had a really hard time of finding some of our boulders when she went back out in October to rescan and try to re-find some of the boulders. Obviously, we were hoping for the GPS to work, so we were hoping that we'd know exactly where the boulders ended up, and in the future we might think about putting passive RFID tags in the boulder with our active tags in order to be able to take a backpack reader and actually find our boulders that way. So to conclude this part, our smart boulders are still in development, but I think this tagging technology shows promise for detection of initiation of landslide movement in real time, both of slow moving landslides and debris flows. These are cheap, around 200 per sensor, enabling potentially installation of multiple sensors across the landslide and collecting a high density of measurements to further understanding of displacement behavior. Measuring displacement per se is difficult currently due to inaccurate GPS, but this could potentially be achieved with the addition of gyroscope and magnetometer sensors, which are actually in the hardware of the tags and just need firmware to be written to enable these sensors. And we have further field and laboratory testing and sensor development planned, although somewhat disrupted by the coronavirus. So we were ideally going to be going out this April before the current ongoing monsoon, but this wasn't possible. So we will continue doing some laboratory testing when we can get back in the lab, improving the sensors, and hope to return next spring for the 2021 monsoon season. So this is just to give you a little test of some of the experiments we started just before being put in lockdown this spring. So these are experiments we're planning in Irina Manzella's laboratory at the University of Plymouth to help validate what our sensors are showing us in a kind of scaled experiment. And we're looking at, well, we've actually already improved the firmware of the accelerometer, so it's now 100 Hertz, 100 measurements per second. And pending funding, we will implement the gyroscope and magnetometer and look at developing machine learning algorithms for actually enabling the boulders to be really smart and to be able to detect certain movements and alert those in a quicker, more timely manner. Okay, so that kind of wraps up the first part. So in the second part, I'm going to be talking about a different type of landslide, shallow rainfall-triggered landslides that occur in places that are really rainy. And there are several challenges for warning of these landslides as well. There's a kind of lack of time for warning. They tend to occur really rapidly when it starts to rain heavy enough. So a typical approach to trying to forecast these is rainfall intensity duration threshold approach. And this is an example from the Ilgraben in Switzerland, where you try to characterize what intensity and combination of intensity and duration is needed to trigger a landslide. This is shown for debris flows, but the same approach is used for shallow rainfall-triggered slides. And the main problem with this approach is the number of false positives. So here we can see that many of these large storms, so the blue crosses, did not actually trigger a debris flow. In fact, around 50% of storms that exceeded this threshold didn't actually trigger a debris flow. And we have the same problem with shallow landslide thresholds too. And this is because other factors are not captured. So things like antecedent rainfall or soil moisture, sediment supply and availability, and so on. And another challenge is identifying where slopes will fail. So this is a threshold for individual catchment of the Ilgraben, but ideally we want to know more spatially across a region that can be impacted by a rainfall event where landslides are going to happen. There aren't as many studies that have looked at predicting the spatial pattern of landslides in response to rainfall, but these are two studies that interested me within the last few years. So this is on the left, a conceptual model of landslide triggering by rainfall by Crozier in 2017, the so-called cell model, where perhaps quite intuitively you would expect the highest density of landsliding in the center of the storm where rainfall is most intense. And then as you go out, other factors start to limit landslide occurrence, such as soil depth. So this is an interesting model to kind of bear in mind for our research in the Philippines. And this figure on the right is from a study by Odan Mark and co-authors in 2019, showing the importance of kind of longer term climatology for preconditioning landslide response to rainfall. So in this case, the 48-hour rainfall total does a reasonable job at predicting the spatial pattern of landsliding in this storm in Japan. But it does an even better job if it's normalized by the 10-year return period, 48-hour rainfall event. This probably says something about the timescales of soil development. So we are interested, one of the things we're interested in on SCARP is the spatial and temporal triggering of landslides by rainfall in the Philippines. The Philippines is hit by around 20 typhoons each year, causing massive problems with landslides and flooding. And we are interested in what rainfall and landscape factors lead to landsliding in typhoons, and what is the potential of satellite-based rainfall and soil moisture data for landslide early warning. And hopefully this will play, but this is a video of Typhoon Mangkhut, which hit the northern island of the Philippines, island of Luzon, in September 2018. And this was captured by the GPM Global Precipitation Measurement NASA data product. So as I said, this is part of the SCARP project, which stands for Simulating Cascading Rainfall-Triggered Landslide Hazards in the Philippines, and is funded by the NERC Newton Agam program, and started early last year. And it's a collaboration with UEA. This is Adrian Matthews, a meteorologist at UEA, Claudia Abanco, the postdoc working on this project with me at Exeter, and then collaborators from MAPA University in the Philippines, based in Manila. This is Phi Tan in the middle of this picture here, and he's the Philippines PI of this project. So yeah, there are several objectives of this project. Quantifying sediment delivery to the river network by landslides. There's big problems with sedimentation in reservoirs, for example. Establishing meteorological drivers and landscape preconditioning of landslides, which I'm going to focus on today, and developing and testing models of cascading landslide hazards. The Philippines, this is a very simplified map on the right here of the meteorology of the Philippines. But it has really complex meteorology with different monsoon seasons on the west and the east, and then imprinted with these typhoons that come in from the east of the Pacific. So we have several study sites over the Philippines within these different meteorological regimes, and the one that I'm focusing on in this second part of my talk is Itagon in the Benguet region on the island of Luzon that was impacted by the typhoon that I just showed the video of in 2018. So the first thing to do was to map landslides in response to the typhoon. And Claudia mapped 1,100 landslides across this roughly 600 square kilometer region near Baguio City, shown here on the island of Luzon. And this is just an example in the image on the right of one of these rainfall-triggered landslides. This was actually a fatal landslide that made it to the news, at least in the UK, because it sadly killed around 70 miners and family members who were camped near the bottom. It had a very long run out, this particular landslide. A major challenge in studying the relationship between rainfall and landslides is actually characterizing rainfall in time and space. And this is just a comparison of the different sources of rainfall that we have for this Typhoon Mangkhut, as well as the wet season leading up to the typhoon. So we have one rain gauge in Baguio City, just to the east of the main area of landsliding, to the west. And then we have GPM satellite data, which has the benefit of having full coverage of our study area at a 10-kilometer square spatial resolution and 30-minute temporal resolution. So we can see here from this graph that one of the first potential problems with GPM data is an underprediction of rainfall, particularly in these intense rainfall events. So it was only predicting around 200 millimeters of rainfall at the peak of the typhoon, whereas the rain gauge would suggest more than double this, so more than 500 millimeters. Regardless of this, we use the GPM satellite data just because we can then look at the spatial pattern of landsliding in relation to rainfall. But firstly, this is just a traditional rainfall intensity duration threshold showing several rainfall events that happened in the lead up to the typhoon in the grey crosses, and then the rainfall of Typhoon Mangkhut in the pink dots. And it's very strikingly obvious that not even just Typhoon Mangkhut, but also several rainfall events in the lead up to the typhoon exceed many of the thresholds for, well, all of the thresholds, both global threshold for rainfall-triggered shallow landslides and, interestingly, thresholds for lahars and shallow landslides for the region. So this led us to think, well, why did only Mangkhut trigger widespread landsliding? So I'll return to this question in a couple of slides. So looking at the spatial pattern of rainfall relative to the pattern of landsliding, we can see actually that Croisier's cell model doesn't seem to apply here if we trust the rainfall intensity distribution characterized by GPM, captured by GPM. And in fact, the highest density of landsliding seem to occur outside of the zone of highest rainfall intensity. However, on the right here, we can see antecedent rainfall over the previous, over the 2 weeks leading up to the typhoon. And this does seem to be a more important control on the pattern of landsliding spatially than rainfall intensity, with landslides occurring within regions of higher antecedent rainfall. We also looked at soil moisture data from the Soil Moisture Active Passive mission of NASA. And this is shown here with the various rainfall events that happened in the lead up to Typhoon Mangkhut in the grey bars along the bottom, and then soil moisture extracted for several cells across the region in the coloured lines. And we can see that soil moisture increased through the early wet season. It seems to reach a limit that's probably defined by the saturation limit of the typical soils in the region, these clay-based soils. And then Typhoon Mangkhut happened in mid-September. Just looking at the graph on the right, Typhoon Mangkhut again is highlighted with the pink dot. And we just see that although soil moisture data from satellites as well as the GPM data show some promise for warning of landslides in this event, it's pretty challenging to isolate this typhoon event from other extreme rainfall events that happened, such as particularly this one that happened in July and had a higher peak rainfall intensity and seemingly an equally high soil moisture content. So I guess this is probably this grey point here. So there's some way to go to basically refine these thresholds based on soil moisture and rainfall for warning of these landslide events. Another possible factor that led to this typhoon triggering landslides when previous extreme rainfall events didn't is something to do with some other characteristic of the typhoon, potentially wind speed, for example. So this kind of more spatial analysis of landslides compared to various landscape attributes shows that there's a really strong aspect control on landslide occurrence. Landslides predominantly happened on east and southeast facing slopes. And this was the direction from which the typhoon came, potentially driving rains most strongly against those slope aspects. So from concluding this part, antecedent rainfall seems to better explain the pattern of landsliding than rainfall intensity. Going one step further than antecedent rainfall, satellite-based soil moisture seems to be useful for developing these thresholds and has potential, together with satellite-based rainfall data, for landslide early warning. But we probably need better ground-based calibration and many more events in order to actually refine these thresholds. And typhoon direction is likely an important control on the slope aspects that fail. So in future work, we are looking to install soil moisture sensors and rain gauges that are being developed by our collaborators at Mapua University. They're actually firstly engineers. And these will be useful to calibrate and validate satellite-based data and work towards landslide early warning, which is something that the Philippines Funding Agency and project partners are really keen for us to do, but we're kind of approaching quite cautiously. And we also will be looking at other events. So we'll be mapping landslides triggered by other typhoons, particularly in other meteorological regions on the Philippines, to better understand variation in drivers and refine these triggering thresholds. And this is just another really interesting aspect of the project, giving training to our Filipino researchers and collaborators just to help us with this landslide mapping effort predominantly, but also training them in various other aspects of landslide hazard assessment. So thanks very much for your attention and interest. And I'm interested in your questions.
Thank you so much, Georgie, for this very interesting talk. And I have now opened the chat for questions, so you're all welcome to write your questions there, or you can raise your hand if you want in the participants panel. So while we wait, Georgie, I was just wondering about the second part of your talk. What is how narrowly can you warn about landslides happening?
Yeah, so I mean, with GPM data, I think you can have the data with a very short lag time. I can't remember what the time is exactly, sort of after the or before the event has happened, that you can get the data. Most of the data that we used in our analysis, I believe, is the kind of post-event kind of refined GPM data. In terms of warning, I know that a team at NASA led by Delia Kirschenbaum are looking into kind of developing, or I think they have actually come out with a prototype warning system for shallow rainfall-triggered landslides based on GPM and SMAP data. So yeah, clearly there is kind of potential of using that data. I think also sort of local weather forecasts are potentially useful as well.
We have a first question by Luca Pellascini. So great talk, Georgie. So do you think the vegetation coverage has something to do with the aspect and location of the triggered landslides?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's something that's been found in other regions, that vegetation has an important control. For example, in the Front Range in Colorado, in a rainfall event, extreme rainfall event in 2013, a study by Francis Rengers and co-authors found that landslides predominantly happened on, let me get it right, I think predominantly south-facing slopes, which get more insulation, are drier, have less vegetation, less root cohesion, and therefore more landsliding. And a follow-up study showed with a model how this root cohesion was really important in that case for either like allowing landslides or preventing them. So in this case, we looked into vegetation, and it doesn't seem to vary a lot by aspect. So that doesn't seem to explain the aspect dominance we have of landslides on south and southeast facing slopes. So we think that it must be something to do with the direction of the typhoon.
All right, we have another question for you from Rebecca Hodge. Thanks. Can you say a bit more about how you can measure boulder displacement using gyroscope and magnetometer data?
Good question. I'm relatively new to these types of sensors, but I know that somehow you can combine accelerometer, gyroscope and magnetometer sensors to kind of reconstruct the position of your object. I don't think it's straightforward. It involves some maths, but I think it's possible. At least we hope it's possible. I think otherwise, even if we can't, even just using the accelerometer shows a lot of potential for detecting kind of initiation of movement and potentially saying something about the dynamics, the kind of rotational dynamics of a slow moving landslide. So yeah, but it's work in preparation.
Okay, we have another question by Aaron Buff. So thank you very much, Georgie, for this great talk. Maybe I missed it, but could you go into how these global and local thresholds were measured or defined? So this is the first question. I would have thought that they are defined based on such events. So how comes that a lot of events fall outside of the thresholds? Are you measuring something different than the studies that define this threshold? So if this is not very clear, I can maybe also ask directly the question using the mic. Let us know, Georgie.
Okay. Maybe I can try and go back. So yeah, thanks for your question, Aaron. I think this is probably the slide that you're referring to. Yes, these global thresholds, like this one from Kane, use sort of a lot of different events as input for deriving these thresholds. Obviously, this one's quite old now, so they don't necessarily capture all of these events. And I think that these tropical regions, or at least in the Philippines, there haven't been many studies of the rainfall characteristics triggering landslides. There have been a couple that we found for this region. Surprisingly, this threshold for the Baguio region is kind of at the bottom here, suggesting a very low rainfall intensity duration needed to trigger landslides, and Typhoon Mangkhut was well above this. So yeah, I think this just shows that events in the Philippines are particularly extreme and maybe have been underrepresented in some of these thresholds. I don't know why this threshold for the Baguio region is kind of particularly low. I don't know why many of these events in the grey crosses in the lead up to Typhoon Mangkhut didn't trigger any widespread landsliding, because you know they well exceeded this threshold. I don't know.
All right, we have another question from Ayush Yoshi. Hi, great talk. I have a question from the second part of your talk. Are you considering geotechnical analysis of soil at landslide slopes in your project? And there's another question after.
Shall I start with the first part?
Yeah, let's do that.
I've got the chat up actually, so I can also see the bottom part of the question. Are we considering geotechnical analysis? Yeah, so a more physically based approach is also possible. And I think our mapper collaborators have actually collected some samples from some of these landslides that were triggered by the typhoon Mangkhut, and have already performed sort of some of these analysis, like friction angle, cohesion, and so on. So it's kind of on our radar to potentially do some kind of physically based modelling of landslides. We're moving on to actually ultimately producing a landslide hazard map for this region, which the kind of local mayor has requested. They do have one, but it's kind of very low resolution and we want to improve on it. And one possibility would be a more statistical susceptibility analysis based on all of these factors such as aspect and slope that we've already considered, as well as soil type and so on. But another possibility would be to run a more physically based model and look at producing a slope stability map, in which case we'd need these kind of more geotechnical parameters. So that's something that we're considering. Phoebe, do you want to read the bottom part?
Yes, yeah, so that's for the first part of your talk. Since landslides keep evolving with time, given the spatial temporal resolution of the sensors, were you able to figure out the changes in landslides, kinematics, and failure mechanism with time?
That's a good question. That's something that we would aim for in the future. We haven't really looked more into the kinematics at this stage. This kind of initial pilot study was really just testing the sensor technology and testing the kind of potential of it for looking at, well, we were hoping to be able to measure displacement with the GPS, which obviously didn't work, but also looking at the potential of the accelerometer data. But potentially we'll kind of think more about that and say something more about it in the paper that we're putting together. But I think we would need ideally a greater density of the sensors and potentially a bit more kind of validation of their movements than we were able to achieve with our first pilot study.
Maybe I can ask a question if you don't mind, Georgie. Yeah. So why do you think that the direction of Typhoon Mangkhut has a significant impact on the location of landslides? Can you give us some insights on why and how you think this occurs?
I'm guessing, or we're hypothesizing just the wind direction basically, and having winds driving rainfall into, in one direction is potentially going to have an influence. I don't know if there's potential for sort of some laboratory-based studies of that idea. And I don't know whether other studies have found kind of a similar phenomenon. It's kind of in the absence of another explanation, really. I mean, the landslides failed really exactly on these slopes facing the direction from which the typhoon came. There doesn't seem to be any vegetation differences between the slopes. I don't know, do you have, I'm interested if anyone has some other ideas or kind of has seen something similar from other extreme rainfall events.
I don't really have any clues on what could be the reason, but maybe one way to look at that would be to have a better idea of the timing, maybe of landsliding during these events. Maybe yeah. This will help to resolve that.
Yeah, that's tricky. We have precise timing of the fatal landslide that I mentioned. And a lot of the kind of the analysis is based on, or the kind of analysis of the temporal rainfall conditions is based on the timing of that landslide alone. But in terms of the other landslides, it's hard to know exactly when they happened. But for sure, that will be that would be great if we could know, and then if we could know with greater kind of resolution when the rainfall was hitting. I guess a greater density of of kind of sensors, maybe of the type that we're developing in the Boulder project, or kind of similar, and then together with kind of rain gauges and soil moisture gauges would sort of help address that question. Yeah.
Thank you.
I also have a general question. So if you have a region where there has been a lot of landslides already, does that increase or decrease the risk of having landslides there the next time you have an event?
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting question. And something that we're looking into, because actually there was a widespread landsliding event in this exact same region in 2009 in response to another typhoon, Typhoon Palmer. So we've recently acquired the imagery post Typhoon Palmer, and the aim is, with help from our sort of Mapua team, to map out landslides from that event and then compare the patterns between the 2009 event and 2018 to try and get at this question of whether, if a slope has had a landslide in the years before, whether that's then more or less likely to fail. I mean, I think this idea of soil availability is really important. And sort of, if you've had a landslide that's removed sort of all of the soil, one idea is that that could take time to regenerate in order to have enough to fail in a future landslide. But there is a study that shows that landslides follow landslides. So actually, if you've had a slope that's slid, that it's then more likely to slide because it's kind of loose and unstable. So, and it also depends on the type of failure. If you've had landslides that have sort of deposited material further down slope, then there's potential for kind of elevated debris flow hazard in the years following. And there's some nice research being done by Tristram Hales and his PhD student in the Wenchuan on this kind of sediment cascade that happens following a earthquake-triggered landslide event. But in this case, we're looking actually for examples of regions that have had multiple landslide events. The real challenge is that it takes so long to get a good landslide inventory. So Claudia took kind of a couple of months or so to map the 1,100 landslides in this event. And actually another part of the project is trying to work towards better automated mapping tools to be able to collect landslide inventories more quickly, and ultimately answer some of these questions that take, at the moment, a long time to answer because of the time it takes to map. So we're working with Simon Mudd and his PhD student at Edinburgh, who are actually completely focused on these sort of new machine learning approaches for sort of automated landslide mapping, hopefully to try and find a tool that can kind of speed up that process.
So we have another question by Eitan Shelef. So thank you for a great talk. So both study areas appear to be modified by agricultural terraces that likely modify both surface and subsurface hydrology. So did you identify any hydrological or topographic controls of these terraces, as well as agricultural activities or seasons, on the likelihood of landslide occurrence?
Yeah, that's a good point. No, we didn't. We haven't thought about that yet, but your question will definitely get me thinking about it. Yeah, I mean, in the nice example I showed, there was a nice picture of back-tilted terraces that I'll try and go back to. What was it? Yeah, in the lower left here. Presumably, those terraces act to route water in some way, presumably sort of back towards the body of the landslide. But yeah, I don't really know how they affect kinematics. it would be interesting to know. It's hard to find a slope that's not terraced in this region as a kind of control. But yeah, that's an interesting question. I'd be interested in how, Aitan, how you think that this might have an influence. Okay, someone has an opinion. In terms of probability, it must increase the probability of the event. I think I agree.
So can you elaborate what do you think this relates to? Because I wasn't sure.
I think that comment relates to the question above about how agricultural terraces might modify surface and subsurface hydrology and presumably have some control on the likelihood of landslide occurrence.
Good. Do we have any last minute questions? You have to then be quick about it in the chat. Otherwise, I want to thank you again. Oh, yes. So there is one here from Christian Lascio. Thank you for sharing your research with us with such exhaustiveness. Did you consider the evaporation conditions as predisposing loamy and clay soils were more prone to landslides under extreme precipitation occurring during the typhoon? Could this process also be associated with the dominance of the east and southeast slopes?
I think that the soil moisture data captures any evapotranspiration, just going back to the just going back to this curve here, you can see that during extreme rainfall events, the soil moisture goes up and then it sort of decreases again until the next event. So presumably this is capturing that evapotranspiration process that happens. I don't know whether Christian is referring to, I really focus just on the graph showing the aspect control on landslides here, because this is by far the most clear sort of landscape control on landslides. I don't know whether he's referring to this panel C here, which shows the density of landslides by soil type. And yeah, you're probably picking up on the fact that there were peaks in landslides in the Cascading clay and one of the loam soils. We don't yet know sort of why that is, why especially the clay seem to kind of preferentially fail. But yeah, it's something to look into, I guess. Okay. Christian's saying that the clay is more sensitive to cracking. Yeah, so I guess cracking and then potentially routing rainwater down into that depth and leading to the saturation conditions that are needed. Yeah. Regarding terraces, my guess is that they are designed to drain towards divergent portions of the slope rather than convergent slopes. Yeah, and if Aitan is right, then obviously the rotational movement of the slide is kind of completely ruining the sort of nice engineering of the local farmers and making them actually converge and route water towards the slopes and presumably accelerate movement. Yeah, thanks for all the comments. They've given me a lot to think about.
All right. But then I want to thank you again, Georgie, for this great talk. And to everybody, we hope to see you again in the fall for the second round of Landscapes Live. And please let us know if you have any suggestions for speakers. You can contact the Landscapes Live. Philippe, can you just remind people about the email? Do you remember?
I'm not sure. I think it's landslive seminar@gmail.com, something like that, I guess.
Okay. Otherwise, you can find it following a link in one of the recent emails. All right. But then I'll just say thank you, everybody. Until next time. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye, Georgie. Thank you.